Hey everybody, it's Angel. You're watching ASMR Angel Reads. We are finishing chapter 5 of Daggerspell. It's a little more than my usual amount of pages I read, but if I bust it in half, it'll just be too short. So this one might be a little over 30 minutes. Last time, Nevin told Cullen that Jill was with the war band because Cullen's injured and in Lovian's castle. That's Rodri's mom. And Nevin's with him. And Addern is with Jill and Rodri. And Cullen was mad that they let Jill go to war with the war band. But he said if she gets killed, he's going to take revenge. The letter from Rice was brief and maddening. My lady, it ran, I understand that your Cadvarok still holds the siege of Dunbrudlin. Since Lord Talion has brought me proof of Lord Corbin's continuing treachery, I will let you settle the matter by sword if you prefer. Let me warn you that even your eventual victory may not quiet all the grumblings against you as long as Rodri is the heir. Lovian crumpled up the parchment into a ball. She was tempted to throw it into the messenger's face, but after all, it wasn't the young rider's fault that the Lord was as arrogant and a pig-headed fool. I take it my lady is displeased, Nevin said. With a little snort, Lovian smoothed the parchment out and handed it over. You may go, she said to the messenger. Have some ale with my men. I'll have an answer for you soon. The lad scrambled up and made his escape from her wrath. Nevin sighed over the message and handed it back. Rice is dead wrong about the grumbling, Nevin said. Rodri's proven himself in this war. Of course, he just wanted to infuriate me to salvage some of this wretched pride, and he's done it quite successfully, too. They were sitting in the great hall, which was particularly silent. Only 10 men, some of the recovering wounded, sat in a room fit for 200. Do you think I should ask Rice to intervene? Lovian said. It aches my heart to think of more men dying over this. Mine too, but if Rice does disinherit Rodri somehow, then all these men who've come to admire him will start grumbling. It might lead to another rebellion, and even more men will die in that. True spoken, Lovian folded the parchment up neatly and slipped it into the kirtle of her dress. I'll calm myself then and send Rice an answer saying his intervention will not be required. Up at Dunbrudlin, the besiegers slipped into a routine that crawled by, tense and tedious at the same time. Since Corbin might have sallied at any moment, everyone went armed and ready, yet there was nothing to do but polish weapons that were already spotless, ride aimless patrols to exercise the horses, and wager endlessly on dice games or another. Although Jill tried to leave Rodri strictly alone, it was impossible to avoid him in so small of a camp. At times, she would go to draw rations only to find him among the carts or come face to face with him as she walked back to the camp after tending Sunrise. That's her horse, Sunrise. At those chance meetings, he said very little and made no effort to keep her at his side, but every now and then when they looked at each other, she would feel that she was drowning in the blue of his eyes. By the 7th day of the siege, Jill felt that she just might go mad from the endless waiting for battle. As she admitted to Addern that night, she was quite simply afraid. Das says that anyone with a sense is always afraid before a battle, so I suppose I can take comfort in that. At least I've got used to the stinking mail. I was sparring with Emir today, and it doesn't slow me down anymore. Well and good then, I've been waiting for that. Jill felt a cold shiver run down her back. Lotta Lane is the key to everything, Addern went on. Corbin's been enscrolled so long that without Lottelaine he never will break, and he'll either surrender or sally. I've already asked Genitar and Calendril to help me kill Lottelaine. Will you come with me when we go hunting the hawk? I will truly, but how are we going to get at him? I'm going to make him fly. I wager I can lure him out because I know him very well indeed. He got up slowly. It may take some time, mind, but I'll just wager he comes to us in the end. After Adern left her, Jill sat by the campfire and wondered what strange dweemer Adern could use to lure his enemy out. She was still musing over it when Rodri stepped out of the shadows as silently as one of the elves and sat down next to her. At an inadvertent touch of his sleeve on hers, Jill's heart began to pound. Tell me somewhat, are you sure that Nevin spoke the truth about my weird being Eldon's weird? I am, Rodri. Are you aching your heart again over having a last fight for you? Well, what man's heart wouldn't ache? But it's not just the honor of the thing. I can't bear to think of you being harmed. I think I'd rather have bards mock my name than risk you getting one little scratch. Has his lordship been drinking mead? Oh, don't be all my lady haughty with me. You know I love you and you love me too. Jill got up and threw a branch on the fire, then watched the wild folk dancing along the dark bark in the long flare. After a long moment, she heard Roderick get up behind her. Jill, I know I can bring you nothing but harm. You're right enough to be cold to me. Jill refused to answer. Please, Roderick went on, all I want to hear is you say you love me. Say it just once and I'll be content with that. Rodri slipped his arm around her from behind and pulled her back to rest against him. The simple human comfort of his touch went to her head like mead. I do love you. I love you with all my heart. His arms tightened around her and then he let her go. She stared into the fire while he walked away because she knew that she would weep if she watched him go. We've got one last hope, the way I see it, Nowick said to Rice. Rice hates this cursed brother so much that he might interfere with just to shame him. He might truly, Corbin said. When they both looked at him, Lottelaine merely shrugged. They had been besieged for 8 days now, 8 stinking days in the hot, dry autumn weather, 8 days of living behind stone walls, a torment for man used to riding with Elsion Lacar. He wanted to make them share his torment by telling them the bitter truth, but he wanted to have a plan of escape laid before he did, if he could find a plan of escape. I've been working on the Gorbert's mind, of course, Lottelaine lied smoothly, but the situation's vexed for him. He has the counselors who argue against intervention. Ah, ye gods, Nowick said. We've got to think of morale. Can you do somewhat faster? The Dwemer has its own times of working. Oh, indeed, you piss-proud beggar. You were quick enough to get us into this mess. Lottelaine stared straight at him. From his own aura, he sent a line of sight and struck at Nowick, spinning the Lord's aura. Nowick's eyes went glazed. I do not care to be cursed. Of course, Nowick whispered, my apologies. Lottelaine spent the aura once more and released him. Besides, I assure you that the question of morale is very much on my mind. No doubt I can keep the men confident of our eventual victory. Lottelaine rose, bowed, and swept out of the chamber. He had to be alone to think. All he wanted to do was to call forth fire and burn the stinking dun to the ground. He would escape. He'd pack his clothes and a few coins in a sack, then fly away alone and free. Somewhere he'd find another lord to enscroll, somewhere far to the east where Adern would never find him. I'll follow you, lad, Adern said, even to the ends of the earth. With a yelp, Lottelaine spun around, but the corridor was empty. Adern's presence lingered like the scent of smoke in an empty hearth. Sooner or later, Adern's voice went on, I'll come in after you, or you'll have to come out. Sooner or later, you'll look me in the face. The feeling of presence vanished. Lottelaine hurried to his chamber and slammed the door behind him. He couldn't escape. Adern wasn't going to let him escape, as somewhere in the heart he'd been sure his father would do, as he'd always done before. Then I'll have to win. If only Adern were dead, Lottelaine could do much more than merely carry messages to the Gorbert. He could send fire into Rice's tents. Hold on. Oh, shoot, I lost my glasses again. I have to wear these. If only Adern were dead, Lottelaine could do much more than merely carry messages to the Gorbert. He could send fire into Rodri's tents, rotten to his provisions, disease to his men and horses, and stir Rodri's army to such a panic that the men would desert like snow melting in the sun. If only Adern were dead. If. Toward the middle of the afternoon, Lottelaine went to the window and tried to call up a storm. If nothing else, it would soak Rodri and his cursed army and give Lottelaine something to brag about to Corbin and Nowick. He called up the elemental spirits of air and water, invoked them with the mighty names, and saw clouds begin to swell and thicken in the sky. Wave after wave, the storm rushed in as his command as the wind picked up strong. All at once the wind died and the clouds began to dissipate. Lottelaine swore and struggled and cursed the spirits until at last he saw one of the elemental kings striding across the sky. Huge and storm-tossed, the king was a vaguely elven shape of silver light surrounded by a pillar of golden light as fine as gossamer. The king waved one hand and the spirits fled far beyond Lottelaine's power to call them back. Lottelaine leaned onto the windowsill and wept, knowing that Adern had summoned the king. Once he had stood at Adern's side and been presented to those mighty beings as Adern's successor. Now he was an outcast and beneath their contempt. It was over an hour before Lottelaine felt strong enough to leave his chamber. As he was going down the staircase, he saw Adern walking up. Lottelaine stood riveted, his hands tight on the rail, as his father came closer and closer. Adern gave him a faint smile of contempt, as if he were showing Lottelaine that he could break Lottelaine's seals any time he wanted and enter anywhere he wished. Then the vision vanished. Lottelaine hurried to the noise and company of the great hall. While he ate his dinner, he was brooding murder. Late that evening, Jill and the two elves were swearing over a game of dice when Adern came to them. He was carrying 2 long arrows. It's time. Which of you archers wants these arrows? I do, Genentar said. The revenge belongs to you, sure enough, Calendril said. I'll have steel-tipped arrows ready to back you if need be. Only then did Jill realize that the 2 arrows had silver tips. Jill, Adern went on, if Genentar can bring the bird down, you might have to finish it off on the ground. Use your silver dagger and only your silver dagger. I will, so the old tale's true, is it? Only silver can harm Dwemer folk? Oh, steel can cut Dwemer folk as easily as it can other flesh, and steel would harm a hawk too. But if the silver kills him, his body will come back to man shape when he's dead. Adern led them about a mile from the camp down the road dimly lit by the first quarter moon. They passed 2 farmhouses tightly shuttered against Rodri's army and came to a meadow bordered by a line of oak. Hide under the trees, Adern said. I'm going to go to throw the challenge. Be ready, will you? He could always outfly me. Adern climbed the lowest tree and steadied himself against the branches to take off his clothes. Jill could just dimly see him, a dark shape among the leaves as he crouched there. She thought she saw the indistinct shimmering image of an owl beside him, then suddenly a glow of blue light enveloped both the shape and Addern. The old Dwemerman was gone. In his place was a silver owl spreading its wings for flight. With one soft cry, the bird leapt and flapped off steadily in the darkness. Jill caught her breath. "It always creeps your flesh," Calendril remarked, "no matter how many times you see him do it." Genentar knocked the first arrow in his bow. Slowly the moon rose higher. Jill kept watch on the starry sky in the direction of the dun, but Calendril saw them first. "Look!" Genentar raised the bow and drew, but it was another good minute before Jill saw the dark speck moving against the stars, the owl flapping and gliding as fast as it could. All at once she saw another bird dropping down from high above, plunging, scooping, nearly catching the owl, flying straight and steadily. The owl and the hawk raced for the trees. The hawk was gaining, muttering under his breath. Genentar stood tense, waiting for the hawk to come in range. Nearer and nearer they flew, and the hawk was getting far too close to the owl. Genentar swore and loosed, but the arrow fell short. The hawk plunged down and caught the owl, grappling with him in the air. They fought exactly like real birds of prey, closing with each other high in the air, grappling and clawing as they fell, then breaking apart to fly up, circling each other to gain height again. Jill heard the hawk shriek with rage every time the wary owl twisted free. Every now and then the great feather would fall to the earth, flashing silver in the moonlight. Jill and Genentar ran out into the meadow under the flight, but Genentar didn't dare shoot for fear of hitting the owl. As they wearied in this unnatural battle, the two birds dropped, swooping closer to the ground, raising less high when they broke to grapple again. Shrieking and clawing at each other, they came down slowly, only to break apart and flap up again. The owl was tiring badly and rose slowly. "Addern," Jill screamed. "Drop low, cursed low." Indifferent to her voice, the hawk stooped, plunging, and caught the owl. Down and down they dropped, and this time the owl made little effort to break free, merely slashed with its beak as they fell. Jill ran off to get a start and waited tensely with the dagger in her hand. She would have only one chance at this, then raced across the meadow and leapt up, stabbing at the hawk. Its shriek of agony told her she'd made her strike, and as she dropped to her knees in the grass, she felt the rush of wings as the owl broke free and flew just in time to save itself from plunging to the ground. Jill staggered up just as Genentar's bowstring sang out. Pierced to the heart, the hawk shrieked once and began to fall. In a flash of blue light, it changed so that for one hideous moment, Jill saw something that was half hawk, half man, feather and flesh oozing into one another. Then it fell to the earth with a sickening, perfectly ordinary thud. The owl called out a long cry of mourning and settled into the grass. It vanished cleanly, leaving Addern sitting there bleeding from long claw slashes all over his body. Jill ran to him. "We've got to staunch those wounds." Addern shook his head no and staggered up to lean on Jill's shoulder. She half carried him over to the two elves beside Laudelin's corpse. He lay twisted on his back, his face clawed, his thighs slashed open from a silver dagger, his chest pierced with a silver arrow. Addern raised his hands heavenward. "It's over. Let him go to the halls of light for his judgment. It's finished." Rolling across the meadow came three great knocks like thunder from the clear sky. Jill cried out, her blood running cold at the sound. Slowly Addern lowered his hands and glanced at the corpse. Even in the gauzy moonlight, Jill could see that he was fighting with all his will to keep himself under control. Genentar laid his arm around the old man's shoulder, whispering gently in Elvish, and led him into the trees. "Let's get this lump of meat back to camp." Calendril idly kicked Laudelane in the head. "The sight should gladden our Cadveric's heart." As they stooped to pick up the body, Jill heard Addern wail, a long, high keening from among the trees. On and on it went in frantic rhythm, so painful that she was glad when they were finally out of earshot. Although she was stunned that Adern would mourn his enemy, all she could assume was that the old tales were true and that working Dwemer together made strong bonds between men. When they staggered into camp with their burden, one of the guards recognized Laudelane and howled his name. The rest of the army came running. Laughing and slapping each other on the back, the noble-born and commoners alike crowded around when they dumped the body at Roderi's feet. "So the bastard bleeds like any other man, does he?" Roderick called out. "Here, men, how do you feel about this cursed Dwemer now?" The army answered with catcalls and obscenities. Roderick held up his hands for silence. "It would only be honorable of me to return the counselor to his lord, wouldn't it? I wonder what this piss-poor little weasel will think when he sees this." The men laughed and cheered him rowdily. Jill looked up at the silent dun and wondered if Corbin and his men could hear the noise. With a touch of Dwemer cold, she knew that tomorrow would bring the battle. The only way that Corbin and Noek could salvage one scrap of their lost honor was to sally and die. Later that night, Nevin attempted to contact Adern. He could feel his old pupil's mind grief-struck, torn, filled with pain so palpable that a few tears came to Nevin's eyes. He broke off the attempt and left Adern alone with his mourning. Later there would be time to talk and learn of the details, but Nevin knew the most important thing: Laudelin was dead. He left the brazier and flung open the shutters over the window in his chamber. Far below him the tiny town of Dungwurmer lay wrapped in darkness and silence. Once a dog barked, once a lantern bloomed briefly in the yard, then went out. The sleeping household would never have known what strange dangers had been threatening them and their overlords, and Nevin was profoundly grateful for it. Over the past week he had been contacting other Dwemer masters in the kingdom who were scattered like a wide mesh net across the land. A few had picked up traces of the dark Dwemer close at hand, and now all were alerted. Soon Nevin might have news of his fleeing enemy. He hoped so, because he would have to make steps against him as soon as he could. "And tomorrow we'll see the end of this little tangle," he remarked to the starry sky. "Oh, dear gods, keep my Jill safe." Okay, I found my reading glasses. They were in the office where I used them last. Anyway, the camp was struck, the baggage train sent farther down the meadow. In the brightening sunlight, Roderi's army sat on their horses outside Dun Brutalin and waited. In the last honorable gesture to the enemy, Rodri had positioned his men far enough back so that Corbin would be able to get his entire force outside before the fighting started. Off to one side, Jill rode between Sligan and Rodri himself. Ready behind them was a squad of picket men to guard their Dwemer warrior. "Remember your orders," Rodri said to Jill. "You hang back and let the rest of us cut your path to Corbin. Then he's yours." Jill smiled at him. Now that the time had come, her fear was far away, a little coldness in the pit of her stomach. Under her, sunrise stamped, battle-eager and ready. Suddenly the wind carried the sound of silver horns ringing in the dun. Jill pulled her mail hood over her padded cap, settled her helm on top of it, then got her shield into position as javelin points winked up and down Rodri's line. As the distant horns sang out again, she drew her sword. The gates to Dun Brutalin creaked open when Lord Paradir at its head. The main body of Rodri's army surged forward, held steady for a moment, then charged as the enemy poured out of the gates in waves. Turning and wheeling into a ragged line to meet the charge, javelins arched through the air and fell as the field exploded with war cries. "Get into position," Rodri yelled at the squad. The men surrounded Jill, but they kept several yards away to give her room to maneuver once the fighting started. She rose in the stirrups and looked out over the field where the dust swirled in thick clouds. Noack and Corbin's men fought gamely, riding in pairs with their horses nose to tail as they fended off the mobs around them. Jill saw a thick clot of fighting around Noack with Paradir in the middle of it. The noise was horrible. Somehow she expected the battle would be such Somehow she hadn't expected the battle would be such a deafening, shrieking thing. There, Sligan screamed, just coming out of the gates. His green shield trimmed with silver, Corbin galloped out on a black horse with a squad of men behind him. With a yell, Rodri waved his squad forward at the trot. All at once, Rodri started to laugh a cold, fiendish delight straight out of dawn time. The squad leapt forward at a gallop and burst into the midst of fighting. Jill felt like a leaf caught in a torrent as they wheeled, screaming and slashing to face off with Corbin's men. Up ahead, Rodri was howling with berserker laughter, and Jill saw his sword swing up bloody in the sunlight. Through the dodging, shifting mass of men and horses, she could just see him, hard pressed by two of Corbin's men, while Sligan tried to come in at his flank. All around, men slashed and swore, horses reared as they tried to shove forward. All at once, Rodri's laugh changed to a bubbling mirth that Jill instinctively knew meant he was in grave danger. She risked rising up in the stirrups and saw Corbin's men parting ranks and letting their lord through. Corbin was going to make one last try on Rodri's life, and she was the only one who could stop him. At that moment, Jill went berserk. A blood-red haze flared up to tint the world. A war cry welled out of her mouth. She could no longer think. She swung Sunrise free of her startled squad and kicked him straight for Rodri, while she slashed and swung and went on shrieking. When a man on a chestnut wheeled to face her, Jill charged in, a battle of nerves that she won when he pulled aside out of her way. When Sunrise turned perfectly to follow, Jill got a good strike on the rider's exposed side that drove him round the saddle. Before she could parry, she slashed him across the face backhand. Screaming, he fell forward under the hooves of his own horse. As the chestnut stumbled and went down, Sunrise dodged without a word or touch from Jill, and she was through, falling into place at Rodri's left. Just ahead in the mob was Corbin's silver-trimmed shield. As she parried a blow from the side, Jill got a glimpse of Corbin's face, sweat-streaked and snarling as he slashed at Sligan. Sligan dropped his sword and clung wounded to the saddle, as an easy mark for Corbin's next strike. Jill howled and slapped Sligan's horse to make it dance back out of the way, barely in time. One of Sligan's men grabbed its reins and fled with his lord. "Corbin," Jill screamed, "your weird's riding for you." He heard her. She knew it from the way he tossed his head and turned her way. For all that she was covered with dust and sweat, he must have realized that she was a lass too, because for the briefest moment he froze. Howling the foulest oaths she knew, Jill fended strikes from the side and pressed straight towards him. Suddenly he wrenched his horse head around and fled, shoving through his men. One of them wheeled directly in front of Jill to cover his retreat. "Coward!" Jill's rage stole her voice. Hitting hard, slashing barely, remembering to parry, she drove for the rider ahead. All at once he broke and wrenched his horse around to a gallop off shamelessly as his lord. Sunrise leapt over a dead horse, and they were free of the mob. Under the pall of dust, the battle swirled across the meadow. Here and there were clots of fighting around one lord or another. Single combatants were scattered across the meadow. Men rode aimlessly, nursing wounds. Far away, the black horse carried Corbin off at a comfortable trot. "Bastard! Sunrise, catch him!" The western hunter flung himself forward as a dead run, as if he too had to sight their prey. Leaping over dead bodies, dodging around combatants, they charged across the field, risking their lives on one rough ground. In the screaming battle noise, Corbin never heard them coming until it was almost too late. But as Sunrise put one last burst of speed, some evil god or another made Corbin glance around. He smacked at his horse with the flat of his blade and made the black dart forward. "Stand!" Jill screamed. "Coward!" Sunrise stretched low and tried to keep up, but he was sweating in acrid gouts of gray foam as the fresh black pulled inexorably ahead. In tears of rage, Jill pulled him to a jog. Corbin was going to get away, and all because he was a cursed coward. Then the black reared up, pawing madly, and came down with an elven arrow in its throat. Corbin rolled free barely in time and staggered up, groping for his sword. With a howl of laughter, Jill swung down and ran for him. Dimly she was aware of Calendar riding to join her. His sword in hand, his shield at the ready, Corbin dropped to a fighting crouch. Under the sweaty dust, his face was dead white. With a shout, Jill thrust forward in the feint, then swept up barely in time. He caught the blow on his shield. "Oh, I can fight, can't I?" Jill said. "You're going to die, Corbin. How do you like your Dwemer prophecy now?" When he slashed at her, she parried easily, the faster by far, and stabbed in from the side. Blood welled up through the mail on his left arm. She pulled free and parried his clumsy answering strike. With the last of the strength in his left arm, he threw his shield at her head. Jill ducked easily and dodged in from the side. She feigned, dodged, feigned again, until he had no choice but to run and step back. Again and again, until he was trapped between her and his dead horse. Shouting a war cry, he flung himself sideways and stumbled. Jill got an easy cut on his face. Blood welled on his cheek. "For Rodri," Jill thrust forward on his name. She struck Corbin full in the chest and his mail shattered. The sword bit deep just below his breastbone. When she pulled it free, Corbin fell forward onto his knees, looked up at her with bubbles of blood breaking on his lips. Then he folded over himself and died at her feet. "Well played," Calandril called. The berserker fit still upon her, Jill swung around to see him dismounting. He was watching her warily, his violet cat eyes wide with the touch of fear, and he kept his distance. "Jill, do you know me?" "I do. You can come up." She turned back to the corpse and saw Corbin's shade, a pale bluish form, a naked body with Corbin's face. It hovered over the corpse while it stared at her, its lips working soundlessly, its eyes filled with bewildered terror. Jill screamed out loud. "What's wrong?" Calandril grabbed her arm. "His shade. Can't you see it?" "What? There's not there." Corbin watched her in anguish of reproach and fear. From the way his mouth moved, it seemed that he was trying to ask her something. Calandril threw his arms around her and hauled her bodily away. "We've got to get to Addern." As suddenly as the blown candle, the berserker fit left her. Jill clung to him and sobbed in his arms. The battle was over. Sword in hand, Rodri rode back and forth across the field and shouted orders to his men. They began to dismount, some collecting horses and leading them away, others looking for wounded among the dead and dying. Paradir and Edar fell in Rodri's side. "Have you seen Jill?" Rodri yelled at them. "I have," Paradir said. "Corbin's dead, sure enough. I saw that Calandril fellow taking Jill to the surgeons. She was weeping, but she could walk." "Oh, by the gods, she's been hurt." Rodri felt tears rising in his throat. "And a fine man you must think me, letting a lass take a cut meant for me." "Hold your tongue," Edar snapped. "You had no choice in the matter, none." "Here, Lord Caverick," Paradir said, "come look at Corbin and then see how shamed you feel about letting the poor weak little lass ride in the battle." As soon as he dismounted by Corbin's body, Rodri saw what Pedar had meant. Jill's blow shattered a well-made mail shirt and split Corbin like a chicken. "By the hells," Rodri whispered, "did she truly do that?" "I saw her with my own eyes, or I wouldn't believe it," Paradir said. "She laughed while she did it, too." Rodri found Jill near Addern's wagon, where the old man was working over the wounded. Jill sat on the ground and leaned back against the wagon wheel while she stared blindly out at nothing. When Rodri knelt in front of her, she said nothing. Where are you hurt? I'm not. No one ever got so much as a nick on me. Then what's wrong? I don't know. I truly don't know. That was all the answer Rodri got to until Adern was done tending what wounds he could. Still exhausted from his battle of the night before, the Dwemer master stood stiffly to one side and watched as a servant sluiced blood off the tailgate with buckets of water. He caught Jill's hand and squeezed it. Are you cut? I am not. All at once Jill broke, turning pale, speaking much too fast. I saw his shade, Corbin's I mean. I killed him, and then I saw him standing on his body. He was all blue, and ah, ye gods, the look in his eyes. Rodri felt himself turn cold, but Adern merely nodded. The battle fit was on you. I heard how you shattered Corbin's mail. Could you do that now, child, in cold blood? Never. It's hard to believe I did it then. Just so it was a battle fit. I don't truly understand it, but it must disrupt the humor somehow, probably in an excess of fiery humor in the blood. But it gave you strength far beyond yourself, and you saw things normally hidden. So his shade was truly there? I thought I was going mad. You weren't. Adern chose every word carefully. What you call a man's shade in real life, the part that indwells his body and keeps it alive, that holds his mind and consciousness. When the body's injured beyond repair, the etheric double, as the Dwemer terms it, withdraws. What you saw was Corbin himself, utterly bewildered at being dead. Jill seemed about to speak, then bolted like a terrified horse, dodging through the wagons. When Rodri started to follow, Adern grabbed him. Let her go. She needs to be alone with this. No doubt. Just hearing you talk creeped my flesh. Here, Adern, I'm a berserker myself, and I've never seen anyone's shade. You aren't marked for the Dwemer like Jill is. Remember that, Rodri Mailweed. Jill is marked for the Dwemer. All at once, Rodri was frightened of this slender, weary old man. He made a muttered excuse and hurried away. Sorry about that. My alarm was going off to turn my orchid lights off for the day. I like orchids. I have a whole bunch. One's going to be in bloom around Christmas time, so I'm pretty excited. Anyway, finished the last couple of pages. Laden with chainmail, exhausted from battle, Jill couldn't run far. She got free of the baggage train, jogged downstream for a bit, then tripped in the long grass and fell to her knees, gasping for breath. She flung herself face down and stretched out her arms as if she could hold the sun-warmth earth like a mother. Wild folk clustered around her. The gray gnome appeared and ran his twisted fingers gently through her hair. At last Jill sat up and looked across the meadow to Corbin's dun, where the green pennant was coming down. Jill had the uncanny feeling that Corbin's shade was wandering through the halls trying to get back home. She nearly vomited. So much for glory. May I never ride to war again. Later she would realize that the jester was a mad one, but at the time all she could think of was to have a bath. She stripped off her mail and her clothes, then plunged into the stream. While she scoured herself with handfuls of sand from the bottom, the gray gnome perched on the grass and watched her. I want my spare shirt. It's in my saddlebag. The gnome nodded and disappeared. By the time he returned, dragging the shirt behind him, it was no longer strictly clean, but at least it didn't stink of sweat and another man's blood. Jill dressed, then rolled the mail up in a bundle. Although she already cleaned her sword once, she did it again until she could be sure that not one speck of Corbin's blood remained. Then she merely sat unthinking in the grass with her gnome until Genitar came to fetch her. You've been out here for hours. With a start, Jill realized that the sun was low in the sky and the shadow of the dun lay long and dark on the meadow. Here, Jill, don't ache your heart over killing Corbin. He deserved to die if ever a man did. It isn't that. It's having seen him, by the black ass of the Lord of Hell. I don't even know what I mean. Jill dumped her mail into the supply wagon, then went with Genitar up to the dun, where he told her the wounded were already settled in Corbin's barracks and the victors were drinking his mead in the great hall. Walking into the ward gave her a peculiar feeling. For days this place had been unattainable as the moon. Now here she was striding across as a conqueror. The great hall was crowded and deafening. Although Jill tried to slip in, half a dozen men saw her and turned to stare, pointed her out to their fellows. Slowly the noise dropped to a silence as man after man turned to look at their Dwemer warrior. At the head of the honor table, Rodri rose to his feet. "Come sit in my place. The God-touched deserve every honor I can give them." Every man in the hall cheered as Jill made her way to him. God-touched, she supposed that's how they had seen her, a favorite of some god or another, rather than admitting that she was merely a woman who could fight as well as a man. Yet no matter the reason, the honor they were paying her was real enough, and all at once the glory of it made her laugh out loud. The noble-born rose and bowed to her. Rodri filled the goblet of mead and handed it to her like a page. "So much for rebels. You've earned your hire, Silver Dagger." With a laugh, Jill pledged him with the goblet. "You have my thanks, my lord, for letting me earn it. I wasn't looking forward to facing Nevin if I rode back alive, and you didn't." Frightened and pale, Corbin's servants crept in to set out a feast from their dead lord's stores. While they ate, the noble-born discussed the disposition Lovian might make of Corbin and Nowick's lands. Apparently there were plenty of land-hungry minor lords among the cloak. As the mead flowed, Jill had little mind to listen to the merits of this cousin or that. All she could think about was Rodri, so close to her. Every now and then he would glance her way with hungry eyes. Jill wanted him so badly that she felt shamed, and then she turned into a slut with nothing more on her mind than having a man's arms around her. Resolutely, Jill rehearsed every bitter truth. He was too far above her. He would only get her with child and then desert her. Worst of all, her father would beat her black and blue. Yet all at once something snapped in her mind. She was the victor at this feast. She risked her life for all these noble lords. A horse was all very well, but why, by every god, shouldn't she have the prize she truly wanted? In a berserker fit of her own, she turned to Rodri and smiled at him. Kept smiling until he grew quiet, bound to her every gesture and glance. Finally, the warbands drank themselves into staggering silence. Jill begged the lords to excuse her and left the hall with Addern. She took him down to the elven tent and made sure he was comfortably settled in, then went to her own blankets. For a long time she lay awake, listening as a few at a time the men stumbled back to their bedrolls. When the camp was utterly silent, she got up and slipped out of the tent without waking Addern. At Rodri's tent she hesitated, but only for a moment before she lifted the flap and ducked in. In the darkness she heard Rodri sit up with a sleepy grunt. She made her way over and sat down beside him. "Jill, what are you doing here? What do you think? You're daft. Get out before I shame us both." When she stroked the side of his face, he went stone still. "Stop it. I'm only made of flesh and blood, not cold steel. And so am I. Can't we have just this one night?" When he refused to answer, Jill pulled her shirt over her head and threw it on the ground. Rodri turned and caught her by the shoulders, pulled her close and kissed her so hungrily that for a moment she was terrified simply because he was so much stronger than she. His hands ran down her back and turned her in his arms while he kissed her over and over. She felt as limp and weak as a rag doll, utterly in his control, but when he caressed her, his hands trembled on her breast. She felt her lust rising to match his. She threw her arms around his neck and took a kiss from him as he laid her down on the blankets. The last of her fear vanished like a leaf burning to ash in the fire. And far away in Dungorburn, Nevin sat straight up out of the sound sleep and knew what had happened. those young dolts. Well, I hope they have the sense to hide it from Cullen, that's all. Okay, that's the end of chapter 5. Finally, I'll do an intermission in a couple of days and then we'll start chapter 6.